Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards. In the last part we went through all of Rockstar and now we're in World 3 Aqua Star. So I believe last time I brought up that largely worlds in this game, while they might have a visual theme, they don't exactly have a gameplay theme that carries between them. Aqua Star is probably the closest thing to that because there are a few more levels you swim in here than in most other levels, but it's mostly due to the boss fight in that regard, even, which we'll get into towards the end of the video. With that said, this is, I'd say, where the game really starts to step up complexity in terms of getting crystal shards done, or even just how many enemies are in your way. On that note, and I'm honestly not sure if this is just my mind playing tricks on me, because it very well could be, but I swear Kirby 64 has more enemies in a general small area than most of the other 2D games tend to. But it also could just be that the camera is pulled far back enough in comparison to those games where I just see more enemies on screen because there's more screen to have enemies on, if that makes sense. So a mechanic we're actually going to see moving forward in the game pretty often is these green little bubbles. They effectively work like cannon barrels out of Donkey Kong Country. You jump in one, they shoot you the direction they eventually face. There are some in the game you actively get to control when you launch out of them, but most of the time they're just an automatic cannon towards one way. Now, we are going to need a specific power combo to get, I think, the third crystal shard in this stage. Specifically, you want to make sure you grab ice and bomb as a combo. Thankfully, you can get both in this stage. With that said, it's very easy to miss ice because it's so comparatively early to where you actually need it. In specific, this penguin here can give you ice. And ice in this game is actually one of my favorite versions of the ability because by default, it gives you a full spread around you rather than just a breath in front of you. Which, mind you, most of my times where I kind of write off fire and ice as abilities is due to me playing Nightmare in Dreamland the most growing up, where it only had the one thing it could do. Largely, those abilities have gotten a lot better in anything else that follows it up. So, bomb ice, you turn into a snowman that explodes after a moment. It's adorable, but also, you do move a little slow while you're using it. So, at this point, let's go back to the game's development step, because I want to talk more about that. Specifically, the next person in the credits is the chief programmer, who's Teruyuki Gunji. He started on the series with Kirby's Adventure, which was also his first credit as a programmer. Then he was a programmer on Alcahest. But then he was a programmer, chief programmer, or otherwise project manager for a lot of Kirby games moving forward. Dream Course, Superstar, Dreamland 3, this, Nightmare in Dreamland, Amazing Mirror, Canvas Curse, Superstar Ultra. But after that, he took a much more notable backseat, being mostly only a director or project manager for P-Cross 3D or its sequel on the 3DS. Notably underneath him is the rest of the programming staff, which is made up of Kazuhiro Sakota, Isao Takahashi, Yoshimi Takahashi, Tetsuya Abe, Yasuyuki Nagashima, and Koichi Watanabe. A lot of them have careers studded almost entirely by Kirby or Super Smash Bros. Games. For instance, Katsuhiro Sakota started on Vega Stakes in the Game Boy, which is another HAL title. But then they were on Dreamland 3, Star Stacker, Smash 1, this, Melee, and they continued working on HAL games all the way up until Box Boy and Box Girl, and they're still in credits for HAL games to this day, being credited both in Kirby and the Forgotten Land as a team supporter, as well as its re-release. Isao Takahashi's a pretty similar story, starting as a programmer on Kirby Superstar and staying with the series largely until around the end of the 3DS, early Switch era, with their most recent credits being Return to Dreamland Deluxe as a line producer or a project manager for Kirby Fighters 2. They're much more involved in the Box Boy series as an assistant producer. Yoshimi Takahashi started on Alcahest in the special thanks section, but was their first credit as a programmer was on Kirby's Adventure. Then they were actually a programmer on Earthbound before going back to Kirby with Dream Course all the way up to the most recent entries, being a team supporter still on Return to Dreamland Deluxe, Kirby and the Forgotten Land, and all that. Their last credit as an outward programmer was Canvas Curse, I believe. Tetsuya Abe started on Metal Slayer Glory on the NES, which is, I think, another HAL Laboratory game that just people don't talk about as much, before becoming a programmer in Kirby's Adventure, and then, again, sticking with that pretty much moving forward, they became a project manager starting from Canvas Curse Beyond rather than a main programmer, but they're still involved in that in some form, even being localization management for Kirby Fighters 2, and being in the special thanks for Dream Buffet, Forgotten Land, and Return to Dreamland Deluxe. Yasuyuki Nagashima started as a programmer on Kirby Star Stacker, then was such on Smash 1, this, Melee, Kirby Air Ride, and Canvas Curse, but Kirby Superstar is actually their last credit that we're aware of, still being a programmer, so they were pretty consistent throughout their career there. Meanwhile, Koichi Watanabe started as a programmer on Smash 64, then they were on this, Melee, Air Ride, Smash Brawl, program director for Poke Park Wii, as well as program director for Poke Park 2, and their most recent credit is actually as a programmer on the most recent Kirby release, Kirby Air Riders, which looks cute. I'll probably pick it up at some point, just not now. Not my priority. I may have even already said that in this LP, but it's been long enough since I recorded the first couple parts where I don't quite recall. It's kind of wild how much the first 2 or 3 days in a work week can do a lot to melt my brain about what I did over the weekend. Before we get more into some of the other major credits, like the next major section, which is actually the designers, I do want to actually talk about something else. I already brought up that Makiko Omoto started voicing Kirby as of this game and has been the voice of Kirby since. But she's not the only voice actor in this game. Masahiro Sakurai himself is also credited as a voice actor in this game. It's actually his only role in the game, too. Because I think by this point, he was already very busy working on Smash. So that became his priority for the next little bit here. At this point, he had basically handed off Kirby to be a series other people worked on. I think the only Kirby games he's been, like, directly hands-on, completely involved in since that aren't related directly to Smash are... I think he was the director for Nightmare in Dreamland, technically. Air Ride, Air Riders, and I think that might be it. Largely, if he's involved in the series nowadays, I think he's just an advisor more than anything, because that guy's plate is full enough as it is. So this is Waddle Dee's big deal in gameplay. You'll be put into effectively little minecart sections in some form or aesthetic where you're just slowly going downhill towards your destination. There could be crystal shards you can miss along the way that are actually some of the more punishing ones to miss. Whenever you see the yellow flashing exclamation mark, that is a warning to jump immediately. It's not a warning to jump soon. It means now, otherwise you're taking some damage. There are times where the tracks you're on, wherever they may be, move more towards the camera, and due to that, the exclamation point can be kind of handy for figuring out when to dodge obstacles you can't see exactly as much. But largely, in most of these gameplay sections, the camera's pulled back far enough where you have more than ample warning for whatever you need to jump over. Again, the bigger problem there is actively the crystal shards, because if you miss one, well, you're going to have to take a death quickly, because there might not even be enough times left for you to take damage before you reach the next checkpoint of sorts. And worth noting, as I believe I may have brought up earlier in the LP, there are several times in the game you can backtrack to rooms to try again for some crystal shards. Rooms like that are basically never that. So if I wanted that crystal shard in that section and I missed it, I would need to pause the game, hit try again, and try again from the very start of the stage. One of the few times the game is as... cruel's the word I'm going to use, but it's not even really that cruel because I'm so used to games doing that stuff anyway. I don't know why, I've always had weirdly consistent issues with this room here. Because this is the first time we're actively fighting the wire current, which isn't inherently rough on its own. But something about the water current in this specific room, partnered with the uphill camera angle, has consistently given me shit when it comes to dodging the spiked logs. We are going to see several that we just saw one of a moment ago. So I usually just take a lot of hits in this room for some reason, and I don't know if it's like just a mental thing or my constant need to push onwards in a lot of games. I don't know. This is actually one of my better runs of this, because I think I've actively had playthroughs where I've died several times in this stage just because I'm just rushing through this section too much. And that might just be me falling into some patterns from other Kirby games like Nightmare in Dreamland, where you can honestly do that pretty easily, and recovery items are either more plentiful or more effective, actually, because if memory serves, with the exception of the rare Maxamato in this game, I want to say pretty much every food item in this game only recovers 1 health, so an individual healing item is potentially less useful than it is in other games, to the point where, because you can more easily get lives in this because of the stars, if you're getting too low on health in an area, it honestly might just be safer to go toward the start of a room and just take an intentional death to get a full health recovery. I don't like to do that myself too much, but it can be effective in some cases. So, worth noting, these cards I'm getting, I'm going to talk more about what they are in specific later on, but they are one of the few things in the game I'm not showing all of along the way. What's really annoying is, if you're trying to get them all, you can get dupes, and you can actually tell if you got a dupe directly from the picnic screen there, because when you get a new card, Kirby's all like, yay, and you get the little sparkle sound effect. If you get a dupe, Kirby starts crying immediately. And you have no way of knowing if you got a dupe until you actively A, see that reaction, or B, check your card collection on the file selection screen. So this stage, the third crystal here is going to require a power combo of Stone and Cutter to get it. But Stone Cutter's already one of the weirder abilities in the game. So I think this is arguably one of the more obnoxious to figure out crystals in the game. Albeit, if you played specifically Kirby's Dream Land 2 and 3... you actively do have a pretty good lead-in to figure out how to get this crystal, as long as you understand what Stone and Cutter does. But I'll save that for when we get there. For right now, let's actually talk more about this game's dev team. Let's actually go talk about the soundtrack composers first. Specifically, there's 2 sound composers, Jun Ishikawa and Hirokazu Ando. I believe I've talked about both of them in some regards over the years because I've covered other Kirby games. I think Jun Ishikawa started with things like Lolo 3, New Ghostbusters 2, and all that, but as of 92 with Kirby's Dream Land 1, they've been a sound composer for the series ever since, still being credited in the sound teams of the most recent releases. And Hirokazu Ando is the same deal. In fact, they're the music lead in the more recent games as opposed to being just another sound composer. Hirokazu Ando did actively start with the game Arcana on the Super Nintendo, though, or Card Master in Japan, which is a game I've talked about a couple times in this same way, usually with some developer working on it. It's a weird little dungeon crawler RPG on the Super Nintendo based around cards. It's got a really neat visual style and all that. Kind of clunky, but still kind of neat if you're looking for something a little bit unique. So on this screen, our main duty is actually to get as high up as we can, as there's a little stone mountain in the center of this screen, and you can actively fall into the top of it to reach a crystal shard. On my first playthrough, I missed this for way too long because for some reason I just didn't think to ride up the planks of water or fly up here. Probably last 5 crystal shards I found in the game. I wasn't a very bright kid, as I think I've talked about in so many ways before. Destroy that block, and you can then ride the rocks back up to get out of there pretty safely. On the topic of power combos, though, I briefly brought up earlier in the LP that some of the combos actually became just their own abilities in later games, and that is true, but sometimes they did it in kind of fun ways. For instance, if you stack 2 stone power-ups, you become a giant stone Kirby who's pretty much invincible but moves pretty slowly. That actually became sort of the metal ability, I believe it was, back in Squeak Squad, for instance. Similarly, Ice, you turn into a giant snowball and can roll around. That became one of the, I think, hyper abilities in Return to Dreamland was the name of that set of things. Bomb Cutter, which we've already seen before, became a part of the Shinobi moveset in some regard. Double Cutter even kind of became a hyper cutter ability that you could charge up, I think, in the RTDL onwards games. But one of the funnier ones that I actually never show off in the game is, I think, Spike Bomb? You become a Gordo that can just float around in the air. It does automatically explode and launch its spikes after a few seconds, but it's honestly kind of fun to actually like use an enemy's ability like that. Though also, to brush on something I brought up earlier in the LP again, there are several playthroughs of this game where I just don't really bother getting the crystals and all that. In those playthroughs, there's one specific ability I tend to use, and if you know the jokes and memes about this game well enough, you probably can guess exactly which one it is, because it is just that effective a tool, but I'll showcase that more in a later world. So this room here is the final room of the stage, and it's here we actually need the Stone and Cutter power combo to get the 3rd crystal shard we saw a moment ago. With that said, there's no way to actually get Cutter this late in this level, so I actively need to, after I finish the level, cut elsewhere, grab Cutter, and then come back here with the power combo. This is probably one of the more out-of-the-way crystal shards to get to if you're trying to get them all, because it's just so late in the given level. But ultimately, no big deal. But what's really unique about Stone and Cutter is that when you use it, Stone Cutter Kirby will cut Stone away from himself to become one of the various animal buddies from Kirby's Dream Land 2 and 3. Dream Land 3 specifically because it has the expanded cast. Rick, Kine, Ku, Nago, Choo-Choo, Pitch, they're all present. Each of the Stone Cutter transformations does have an ability representative of the animal buddy you randomly transform into. For instance, as Ku, you can fly around a little bit. I believe Nago, you can't really walk too quickly, but you get a triple jump. Choo-Choo, you can jump pretty high, but only once at a time. Pitch, you can fly pretty quickly ahead of yourself and jump multiple times in a row. It's probably the best transformation out of the set. Kine's the absolute worst, though, in that you can do nothing as Kine in it. Not even underwater for once. But to get this crystal shard, we need to randomly transform into Rick, because Rick in this game has the very special ability of being able to jump up walls as long as you're holding up against it. With that said, you still need to have him be the one that shows up, and the transformation is completely random every time you press the button. You might get it immediately, it might take a minute. It really just depends on your luck. I do love the character models representing the Dreamland buddies, because they're all so cute. But again, Kirby, cute, you don't say. As we go out to finish this level and enter the final main level of Aqua Star, let's get back to the game's staff. Let's finally talk about the designers, which is easily the longest set of people in the game's dev team. In order, we have Kenichiro Kita, Reiko Iwao, Michiko Takahashi, Hiro Takashita, Shigeru Hashiguchi, Tetsuya Mochizuki, Tomomi Minami, Sanai Kubota, Yoichi Tsukino, Tatsuhiro Tanoe, Tadashi Hashikura, Masanobu Yamamoto, Tsuyoshi Wakayama, Hitoshi Kikawa, Satoko Nakamura, and Kunio Watanabe. Kenichiro Kita started as a designer on Kirby's Dream Land 3, then immediately went into this. They were then a designer on Melee, design support on Air Ride, and then they were then a lead designer or even lead character designer on Kirby games moving forward, like Kirby's Fighter Deluxe on the 3DS, Kirby's Blowout Bash on the 3DS, lead designer. Forgotten Land, they were the lead character artist, so Mouthful Mode is probably their responsibility. And they're still a supervisor with HAL to this day, even being credited as a supervisor as such for Air Riders. Reiko Iwao, on the other hand, has a pretty small dev sheet. She was a designer on this. She was a design support member on Melee. And then she was seemingly one of the main designers for the Air Grind minigame in Nightmare in Dreamland, and that's it. This is probably one of my favorite levels in the game, by the way, because there's something about the visuals that's just so soothing, even compared to the rest of this game's really relaxed nature. And the music's always weirdly reminded me of Nights, but I think that largely comes down to the similar use of chimes to some of the Nights music in my memory. Next up in the game's design team is a bit of a special mention, Michiko Takahashi. She started as a designer on Kirby Star Stacker, was then a designer for Smash 64, this design team on Melee, but then she was the menu designer for Nightmare in Dreamland, Air Ride, Meteos, she was a graphic artist, and then she was a 2D designer for Brawl, on top of some other things after that, specifically Kid Icarus Uprising UI designer, UI design for Smash 4, UI design for Ultimate, and UI design for Air Riders. I did have a laugh, though, when looking at her projects, specifically on Moby Games, because they leave her projects off ending at Brawl, when she worked on those things I just mentioned afterwards. But it's probably because her last name changed. Because she is now Michiko Sakurai. She married Masahiro Sakurai, the creator of Kirby himself, I believe sometime in the late 2000s? I want to say they both left HAL at around the same time to form Sora Limited, where they've been ever since. And not for nothing, Michiko Sakurai is probably a name more people should know because more people have seen her UIs than probably a lot of other game UIs have ever been seen, because her work on the Smash stuff is just so iconic at this point. The latter half or so of this level is pretty straightforward. It's effectively an auto-scroller where you're being pushed around by water currents. And dodging and weaving around enemies isn't too bad here because of your lateral speed being pretty good underwater, even if your vertical speed isn't. With that said, after the mini-boss coming up, keep yourself towards the bottom of the water current areas, as the third crystal shard is placed pretty quickly in a little divot down there. And it's easy to just overlook that if you're trying to rush through and follow the water current. Continuing on with the design team, though, next up is Hiro Takeshita, who started as a designer on Superstar, worked on this, was a design supporter for Melee, and then their last two titles, at least listed on mobile games, are Nightmare in Dreamland and Air Ride as a designer in both. Shigeru Hachiguchi, next up, is one of the few developers we've talked about thus far that has a pretty notable history before working on Kirby. Specifically, they were a graphics team member on Rollerball, Shanghai on Game Boy, they were a debugger. New Ghostbusters 2, they were a designer. Metal Slater Glory, they were a graphic designer assistant. And they were the designer for Arcana, the game we brought up a few moments ago. But starting in '93, they were a graphic designer on Alcahest, and they were a character designer on Kirby's Adventure, and they've been a CG designer or character designer ever since. Kirby's Dream Course, Dreamland 2, Superstar, Dreamland 3, Star Stacker, 64, Smash 64 even, Kirby's Air Ride, Return to Dreamland, Canvas Curse, Robobob. If there's a new Kirby game that's come out, they're likely a designer, design manager, motif designer, team supporter, something like that, still involved in the series to this day. With that, once we come up here, we're at the end of this level, so it's time for us to move on to Aqua Star's boss fight. And it's a bit of a familiar one if you've played prior Kirby games. With that said, before we go in there, I am going to want a copy ability, and not for nothing, one of the best ones for this upcoming boss fight is one I've already used in this LP. I really recommend Cutter Fire, or I guess technically it's Cutter Burn, the one that's a giant fire sword, as I briefly touched on this when I first used it back in part 1, but it does actively just ambiently cause damage when you hold it out, and against Acro here, that can be pretty good. This is a returning boss fight from Kirby's Dream Land 3. In fact, the first half of this boss fight pretty directly references the latter half of that boss fight. He's going to slowly scroll left or right, firing some items at you in the process, usually some very small enemies or Gordos and all that. When you get against a wall, he'll occasionally do a body slam at you or directly charge at you, but that's pretty easy to dodge. I believe when he does a dash in specific, he can ram into the wall and rocks can fall. And if you're going copy ability list, that's the best time to damage him. Upon depleting the health bar, the camera will slowly move up into this vertical tunnel, and you need to be careful because if you go too low at the screen at this point, it is a bottomless pit and you will die. And not for nothing, Acro's clearly a very persistent little guy because it's time for phase 2. Most of Acro's attacks in this phase are just directly dashing at you from below or above. But you also need to watch out for the other enemies that spawn in this tunnel along the way, on top of the fact he can also spit some enemies at you here and again. For me specifically, the hardest part about this specific phase of the fight is either getting too impatient about trying to do damage and taking some dumb hits in the process, or in some cases getting too greedy with damage and falling too far into the bottomless pit and thus losing the life entirely. But yeah, that's why I really like Burn Cutter for this fight. You can just kind of stand next to him and do damage, and you don't need to worry about doing active attacks too much at all. That's Aqua Star done. Time for our next world. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 4, it's time for World 4, Neo Star. See you guys then.